Good evening, and thank you for coming. We're really pleased to have you. My name is Jenny Darrell, and I'm a member of PEG. And if you haven't been to one of our forums before, PEG stands for People for Effective Government. It's a Spokane-based, nonpartisan coalition. Our mission is to support bipartisan approaches to governing, which are fiscally responsible and ensure an adequate social safety net, as well as to promote a civil society. The members of PEG are committed to changing current political climate in which our two major parties have become increasingly polarized. More specifically, we're committed to encouraging sincere and civil debate about the challenges that face our nation and effective solutions for those. Developing compromise policy that finds a reasonable balance between the positions left and right, thereby benefiting the majority of our citizens. And holding elected officials accountable for their actions regarding those bipartisan efforts. If you're interested in learning more about PEG and possibly becoming a member, please visit our website, pegnow.org. And I've written it up here, but it's also on our poster there and on the brochure. So, tonight, our topic is presidential leadership and emotional intelligence, and I'm pleased to see this great audience come to hear this. And we're very fortunate to have someone in our community who has expertise in this area. Dr. Joe Albert is an associate dean in the School of Leadership Studies at Gonzaga University. He's been on the faculty since 1994, teaching graduate and undergraduate courses in leadership, organizational theory, psychology and leadership, storytelling, organizational change, and project management. I'd like to welcome Dr. Albert to PEG.
Wait, don't you guys have something better to do tonight? Jeez, what a crowd. Thank you. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it. I was going to talk about 15th century Peruvian folk dance, but that's probably going to miss the mark. So thanks for coming. And thanks, I know a bunch of you, which is, I'm not sure that's good or bad, actually, but we'll get through this. So I kind of start oftentimes when I talk about leadership with our own experience of it, and might as well do that tonight. I got hired in Gonzaga in 1994, and by this guy that was ended up being my boss, and we just connected really well. I thought he was the greatest guy ever. And I remember about a year into my time there, I went over to Victoria, British Columbia for a recruiting trip, and came back, and I was so excited. There were some people that were interested in our program, so in our master's program, and so I came back, and I sat down with him. He goes, "How'd the trip go?" I said, "Great. You know, here are my receipts, you know, for reimbursement." I'll never forget that he looked at them, and he sort of, you know, worked his way through them one by one, then took them, ripped them up, and threw them in my face. And he goes, "Don't ever bring this crap to me again," you know. And I thought, welcome to Gonzaga. This is great, you know. And then the meeting ended. He was out in the hallway talking to people, laughing, life of the party, great guy. And I thought, this is how this works, you know, with some people. His long-term aspiration was to be a university president, and what I learned was that there were a lot of those incidents in his background, like carnage, I called it, you know, and that always prevented him, I think, from becoming more than he could have. He didn't regulate very well. And I don't know if you've ever had a boss like that or worked with people that didn't regulate well, but it's painful. And what I learned was that his style of regulating meant that he would be upset, lay into somebody, and then he'd be fine. And that was the pattern over and over again. I moved out here in 1975 and to do volunteer work from New Jersey. And then in summer of 77, I went home and found out my dad had terminal cancer, so I took care of him until he died. And so it was just my mom. And I didn't want to leave her right away, so my cousin got me a job at a car dealership in Jersey, right? And so I worked there as a service writer. If you've ever worked at a dealership or know much about service writers, write up your concerns and then take your keys and you get the shuttle to work and hopefully it'll get fixed. Well, what the GM at this, it was the largest Ford dealership on the East Coast at the time. His name was Ned Bogar. Never forget him. And he noticed that I had pretty good skills with people. Some people would be upset, whatever. And he said, boy, you're really good with folks. He goes, I'm going to give you a promotion. I thought, all right, this is great, you know. And so he created a position called the Customer Complaints Manager. And I thought, okay, that's great, you know, and so with that, various people would come and I'd have to talk them down and so forth. And Ned and I really got to know each other pretty well. My dad had just died. His wife had just died. We would literally sit in his office sometimes and he would just cry and talk about how much he missed her. Then I'd talk about my dad and his passing and so forth. And I remember I went into him one time. There was an older couple that came in to see me and said, Mister, do you handle complaints? I said, yeah. They said, well, we just bought a used car from this guy. And he said there'd be a spare tire and a jack in the trunk, and neither is there. Can you help us with that? I said, really? They said, yeah. So I went out and checked. Sure enough, not in the back, not in the trunk. So I went over to the used car portables and walked into the office where the sales guy was, and this is classic 70s Jersey, right? Guy has a silk shirt on, the chain around the neck. He's looking in the mirror like this as I walk in. I said, hey, you know, here's the situation. This couple's out there, and they're like, oh, Joe, just ignore them. They're not going to give you any trouble at all, and they'll go away. Just ignore them. And I said, well, so I went and told Ned, right, the general manager, and I said, Ned, I don't know what to do. This couple's there, and the sales guy said that. And he goes, the sales guy said that? He said not to worry about it, to ignore them? And I said, yep. He goes, let's go. And with that, he puts on this really expensive long wool overcoat. Never forget that. And we march across the parking lot because it's winter and to the portable where the sales guy is. And he just walks right into the guy's office. And the guy goes, Ned, what do you want? And he goes, did you tell that couple that? And then you told Joe the same thing? And he goes, yeah, they're fine. Don't worry about it. He goes, you're done right now. And I'm going to stand here and watch you clean your desk out. And the guy's yelling obscenities and all this stuff. And Ned stood there, you know, and I'm like, you know, behind him. Sure enough, the guy left and he was done, and that's it. Whatever that couple wants, you give it to them. Because we don't treat people like that here. Two really different kinds of leaders. The first one really helped me learn about self-regulation. The second, Ned, the car dealership guy, probably the best boss I've ever worked for in terms of integrity, self-management, self-leadership, and so forth. And so that's kind of the lens I bring into this. I'm not a presidential historian. Please don't confuse me. My background is in counseling, psychology, and leadership. So I've done a lot of coaching, consulting for a long, long time. And tonight I just wanted to touch on kind of some reflections, quite honestly, about there's a lot of ways of talking about presidential leadership, and a lot of books out there. It's a little overwhelming. A lot of different sort of lenses, if you want to call them that, when we think about how do we look at greatness in presidential leadership. And certainly our opinions influence us, our political persuasions, but I want to look at it a little bit differently, and that's through the lens of psychology, almost presidential personality, if you want to call it that. There's a number of these that you could use, you know, birth order, temperament, hierarchy of needs. But again, think about your own experience of leadership. What has worked in your mind in terms of the best bosses you've ever had or noticed? What inspires you about people? It's often about vision and so forth and so on. So tonight what I'm going to do is talk about a lens in a way that I sort of use a lot, and it's called emotional intelligence. And I'm going to explain a little bit about emotional intelligence and actually get into some cases. And we'll begin a little bit with probably one of my favorite case studies. I thought this was funny. Some years ago, I gave a talk up in North Idaho, and there was a group of a couple hundred people. I said, I'm going to talk about Lincoln now, and I popped a picture up there of like this 6-year-old kid, you know, contemporary picture, and I said, this is Jimmy Lincoln. This is a kid I grew up with, you know, and see, you guys think it's funny. There was like nothing. I mean, crickets in the audience. It was awful. I'm like, guys. Everybody's like, what's he talking about? It's like that. It's like, it's a joke. Come on. You got to have fun with this a little bit anyway. So Abraham Lincoln, I loved his story of struggle. And that's kind of what inspired me. And one of my influences is a book called Lincoln's Melancholy by Joshua Shank Wolf. And he really looks at Lincoln's battles with depression and melancholy, how serious those were. And how his struggle through them enabled him to become a better president. And I'll explain. So he's a really big guy, apparently. And most of you know all this, and nothing too striking here. But and that's the sort of the highlights in a way. And I'd be happy to share these slides if anybody wants them, and not a big deal. And a lot of you have seen this too. This is Lincoln's battles with failure, right? Look at all the loss. Look at all the defeat. And then, oh, by the way, he gets elected president. And the first time I saw that, I thought, how does that happen? You know, how does somebody, what about resilience, perseverance, all the things that I think must have led to that. So that was kind of the beginning of my curiosity around Lincoln. And I love looking at his face while he's still young. And I'll show you some pictures as he gets a little bit older. And you just see the battles that he fought internally as well as externally. 1818, again, death of aunt, uncle, mother, wife. And that 1840 is when he really starts to talk about suicide. He goes for these long walks with a rifle over his shoulder into the woods by himself. Not good. And pretty severely depressed. And what was interesting, at least for me, was that at one point, and this is his famous quote, many times I've opened with this, you know, I'm now the most miserable man living. Some days I feel like that. But the darkness and the kind of the lack of hope, all that it's just a powerful quote. I never have to read it. I just let it be up there and let people sort of imagine the darkness that he was experiencing internally as he started to sort of wonder, should he remain alive or not? I think that was part of his own battle. But what happens with Lincoln, which I found pretty intriguing, is he begins to kind of engage with the melancholy, with the depression. There's some experimentation about treatments at the time, but for him it was like, what gives me hope? What allows me to live day to day and keep wanting to live? And so what you see are things in his life, from storytelling, humor, poetry, engagement with others, things that really allowed him to find life and to find hope, and actually alleviated some of the depression that he was battling. If you saw the film Lincoln, you know, with what's his name? Oh God, good Joe. Great film, anyway. Daniel Day-Lewis. Yeah, the storytelling thing is really evident, you know, and it sort of drives some people crazy. But for him, it was always a way of thinking. And narrative is something I teach a lot about. And I think storytelling is really a way we think, we make sense of things. It's a way we engage other people. He became accomplished at it, quite honestly, as well as the humor. And all those things are what I think prepared him to be a much better president. And this was interesting to me because, in a sense, a very divided, psychologically divided individual internally, he becomes president of a nation that's divided. It was just an interesting sort of the timing of his presidency was, to me, always compelling and one of the things I think that made him great, at least in my opinion. So for Lincoln, psychological health, for a lot of us, it's not a battle. I know for me it is, you know, to deal with anxiety, depression, all this stuff, you know, and for him as well. There was a wisdom that came in those struggles. I'm really big, and I'll touch on this theme a few times tonight, but the gifts of struggle, quite honestly, the gifts of struggle. And every one of us in this room have been through stuff. I mean, there's no way around that, and our ability not so much to shy away from the struggles, but to understand them, to engage, and realize what the gifts are in the struggle. I teach storytelling both to grads and undergrads, and Wednesday nights I teach my undergrads, and it's always a packed class, about 30 students or so. And well, I'll say we're going to tell stories in here that are hard to tell. We're going to talk about our own struggles. And kids are like, yeah, that's not really what I signed up for. Like, I kind of want to just I want to be a better public speaker. So what class is that? I'm like, well, that's not this class, Flash ahead, like the other night, we're sort of, kids are sharing their stories. There's some painful stuff that kids have been through. Every kid, every single kid. A lot of people know the Gonzaga kids are all these wealthy, kids from nice homes. They've all had struggles in some way, shape, or form. And to shine a light on those and to engage with those and to understand those and what gifts we got from them, to me is critical. And you'll see that with the presidents that I touch on tonight. Each of them struggled in some way. And I'm really big on sort of learning from those. And Lincoln's maybe one of the best examples of that. So a little bit about Lincoln, and then I'm going to talk about, some of you have probably read this, Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Leadership in Turbulent Times. I had a hell of a time getting through Team of Rivals. I don't know, how many of you read Team of Rivals? Did you actually read it? Boy, that was like, my God, like on the cover it says, millions have read this. I'm like, really? I mean, this is hard, There's like names galore and stuff. But this one I found very readable and very accessible. What she does is take 4 presidents, Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, sort of talks about them in terms of, sort of biographical stuff, but more importantly, internally, what was going on for them in their lives before they became presidents that prepared them to be presidents. And so I found it kind of a fascinating conversation. So with that, let me just do a little bit on emotional intelligence. So most of you are probably familiar with it, so I won't spend too much time on it, but I want you to at least have a sense of where I'm coming from it. So real simply, emotional intelligence is about self-reflection, the ability to know what you're feeling, to think and want inside, an awareness of that. Secondly, self-regulation. How do I manage my emotions when I'm upset? Especially anger, fear, sadness, all those things. And then finally, empathy, the ability to really imagine what it must be like to be someone else in someone else's shoes. So they're the 3 dimensions when I talk about and teach emotional intelligence. That's kind of how we do it. This graph is up here for one reason only. It took me so damn long to get those circles right. I swear, I'm in my office, and it's like one's bigger than the other 2, and it's like, God, Joe, this is like a whole afternoon just doing that graph. That's the only reason it's up there. I'm going to skip it now, but that's it. And I'll show it later, actually, in case you missed it, so I'll come back to it a little later. Self-reflection is just kind of a self-awareness. It's knowing what I'm feeling and being conscious of it versus just being external and attacking people like my first boss did when he threw stuff in my face. He really lacked awareness. Like if I asked him what he felt, he would just take my head off, basically. But self-awareness, which I think comes from self-reflection, quite honestly, is really about knowing what you feel and what you think and what you want, those 3 things. That's another graph I had a hard time with, but I figured this one out. Emotions. Healthy emotional awareness. I love the Lincoln quote, a person will be just about as happy as they make up their minds to be. This is a guy that battled depression, right? That's like hard-earned wisdom in my mind. That ain't easy to come to that place when you've battled as long as he had, I think. Absolutely. So, and emotions oftentimes are kind of like data. They surface within us as sources of kind of information, if that makes sense at all. When I'm angry, it's perceived unfairness. Something's bugging me here, that type of thing. So let me just get into it a little bit. These are the 7 basic emotions as I think about them, and each has gifts. That's how I think about emotions, and I used to work as a school counselor with little kids, and I'd have a big feeling map in my wall in my office because kids many times don't have a vocabulary for emotions. So they'll act out their emotions because they don't know what to do with them because they're inside and they need it. It's like energy. They need to express it in some way. So one of the gifts you can give, especially younger people, is a vocabulary to talk about what it must be like to feel shame, to feel anxiety, whatever, those kind of things. And that's one of the things I think so many of us struggle with. But I've always treated it like a dashboard internally, like, okay, like fear. What's that about? Or anxiety. Like driving up here tonight, right? I figure Jenny's going to kill me because I'm late, and so that's fear. But then I went to, anxiety too. What if this isn't what people want to hear? What if it's not useful? I got all this stuff in my head. So learning to manage that a little bit is the kind of challenge I face pretty often, actually. A very interesting emotion is here, shame. Shame is a driver for so many of us. It's a feeling of kind of not being enough. It's not like you didn't do enough. It's like you're not enough. And I run into a lot of folks that are sort of high achievers that are sort of always trying to escape that feeling of shame, of, they're always trying to overachieve to prove they're worth it. And you get a little taste of that with high achieving people sometimes, I think. And it's like in my class in storytelling, I'll actually do an evening where we just tell shame stories. Like, give me a shame story. Something from, where did you learn that you weren't enough at some point in your life? And that's hard, to talk about, but it's also a driver. And part of self-awareness is being aware of those drivers so they don't control us. As Ginny knows and others that know me very well, I'm a big Bruce Springsteen fan, and he has a autobiography. Actually, it's very well written, but he talks about emotions. He was in therapy for 30 years almost, and he said, most of my life, my emotions were in the driver's seat. I didn't even know what they were, but they were driving me, fear, anger, all this stuff. And he says, but now as I get older and try to come to terms with some of this stuff, they're still in the car, they're in the back seat though, and I'm driving. And it's a very interesting way to think about our relationship with our emotions. Less they're controlling us, the more we're aware of them, we see them in the back seat. And they're good data, sources of good data, but they don't control us. They don't drive us. And that's kind of an important part of this, I think. What happens if we're not particularly self-aware? Well, anger, you can imagine. Anxiety, too much anxiety can paralyze us, overwhelm us. There's a book called Just Enough Anxiety, Robert Rosen. And it's really a good conversation about, the use of anxiety to motivate us. But too much anxiety paralyzes people. Just enough can go, oh crap, I got to get ready for this, kind of a thing. So fear, healthy emotion, but too much can often, I think of my sister a lot, who lives back in New Jersey. She's a little older than I am. And I see her as she gets older and her world gets smaller and smaller. She goes, well, wouldn't you be afraid to go there? I mean, I wouldn't go overseas and I wouldn't go there by myself. It's just like, see this sort of world shrinking a little bit. And it's like coming to terms with that, I think, is part of her challenge for sure. Sadness. And a lot of us have been touched by sadness early in our lives, like Lincoln. And in fact, a lot of leaders. Your empathy often comes from your experience with sadness. And so people like Lincoln, who had a lot of loss, and I'll share what some of the other presidents also dealt with, but sadness can be a great source of empathy, but it can also overwhelm us. Depression, and as we spoke about with Lincoln. And then finally, shame. Too much shame there's almost a relentlessness about pursuit of some achievement or goal. So I'll feel like I am enough. I am enough. And sometimes I'll see that when I worked with kids, parents that really push their kids to achieve always. There came, I think, for a lot of the kids a sense, it's almost like a contract. As long as I achieve and do well, then I'll be okay. I'll be loved. I'm accepted. But if I'm not, then... So you often get the kids that are trying to sort of overachieve to compensate a little bit. So they're the basic emotions, I think the gifts and the challenges that come with them. And I would invite you to think a little bit about, for you as you think about this, because that's what I wanted to weave in tonight, not just sort of stuff about the presidents, but also for you, your own growth, your own challenges, and what you might do with some of this material. So with that, as you think about those emotions, what are the ones that have the most juice for you? What are the ones that, I don't really go there very often. I don't really think about that. I just do this with it. And that's oftentimes, I think, when we'll find leaders struggling, like the boss that threw the receipts into my face. His anger was something that I think he never learned to manage. I really liked him a lot. He was a good guy, but he just never learned to understand it or see it within himself. And it was unfortunate, because I think in a lot of ways it derailed his career. So emotional awareness, I think, is important. This, to me, is probably one of the important parts of any kind of leadership, but how we interpret events. And I'll spend a little time on this, because this is pretty critical. I think, and a lot of people call it temperament, but I love Lincoln's quote. If I've been too familiar with disappointments to be very much chagrined by losing, only after being defeated maybe 5-6 times would I deem it a disgrace and stop trying. Isn't that great? Like 5-6 times. Like once and I'm done, and he's like, keep trying, you just keep going after it. I love that resilience. And a lot of us, and what you'll see in the other presidents too, is an ability to sort of push through. And that temperament, that ability to kind of not quit. And I think this is kind of really an important one. One of my favorite leaders ever is a guy named Ernest Shackleton. Some of you probably are familiar with his endurance expedition. And a lot of people didn't think he was great before, not great after, but during the endurance expedition, those years, 1914 through 1917, this is what he demonstrated. Resilience, an ability to push through, even when the ship crushed down in Antarctica, right? All those guys, everybody's like, oh crap, what are we going to do now? And it's like a 2-year journey, and he didn't lose a single man. An amazing story. His optimism and ability to stay hopeful was key for him. And it's a very inspiring story, and it's like, can things get worse? And they do. And he just keeps pushing through. It's an amazing story, really. These presidents that we'll talk about here, I think, show the same thing. Theodore Roosevelt, I didn't know anything about him really until I started reading this sort of recently. But a lot of loss in his life, and a lot of health stuff that he pushed through early. And really inspiring, and that became his goal, was to try to inspire other Americans. And he was always curious, but always trying and always pushing forward. When you think about optimism, I just want to punctuate this a little bit, because you don't want leaders that go, oh crap, we're all going to die. Like, that never inspires people, right? So how do people that are optimistic think? I mean, what is this? And this is something you can learn. Seligman's book, Learned Optimism, has this sort of developed a little bit. Bad events are temporary. It's not an endless string of hopelessness. Bad events have specific causes that can be remedied. You can fix this, right? And then finally, when bad events occur, it's something outside of yourself. You didn't sort of cause it necessarily. You're not the source of it. These are things that can be managed. I'm going to give you a couple examples. Always start with my mother. My mother was a lifelong victim. I mean, it never mattered what was going well in her life. Didn't want to hear that. This is the story of my life, When we had her in an assisted living place back in Jersey, years ago now, I'd go and visit, and she hated living there. If you know anything about Jersey, Haddonfield is this really nice sort of beautiful historic little town, and that's where we found this beautiful sort of assisted living facility. I say, Mom, how's it going? It looks like a beautiful place. This is a hellhole. Okay. People take your stuff. The food's awful. God, you guys put me here. I can't believe it. I always tell people, my Joe wouldn't do that. I'm like, well, it's kind of awkward, but sort of did, I mean, it's hard. Sorry you feel that way. And then inevitably, every visit, right, would come the story of my father. Never should have married that man. And like my sister and I are sitting there listening to this, And I said, well, Mom, he tried. You know what? At the wedding, the best man dropped the ring on the altar. Should have followed that ring right out the back of the church. And my sister and I look at each other. Oh, that's one, and then we'd hear it 10 minutes later, I said, well, Dad tried. He had a lot of health issues, 36, 37 major surgeries in his life. Well, yeah, just like him. And then you know what? He retires, and what does he do? He dies. And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure he really thought that through, like that was the plan. Well, he left me, Well, okay. Well, and then I'll bring up something like, do you remember when you won the church bazaar, $500, Well, somebody stole it. Okay. There was nothing that would ever turn that around, it really isn't. This is just FYI, if you ever are counseling, mentoring, a lot of you are mentors for younger people, coaching people. I had a conversation recently with someone that I was working with, and they wanted to give some critical feedback to somebody else, and they said, how should I do it? And I said, well, if you say you're a lousy blank, you're a lousy accountant, like what does that mean? You can't do anything with that, right? Specifically, what can I work on? Like those of you that coach, those of you that have been anyway working with folks, you give people feedback that allows them to grapple with it and say, okay, this is something I can work on. I'm looking, Ward Sandberg's here, Dwayne Swinton, these guys coach my kids so well, actually. And they're always good at giving specific feedback, Just to tell me I suck, that doesn't really help, And so any kind of feedback that's very specific to a technique, to a behavior, something I can fix, that's going to help me grow, right? And that's just something that I think when you think about optimism, it's the way to use it in a way that I think would be useful. And what we've seen with the presidents that we're talking about tonight is that actually. This is, Franklin Roosevelt. There was always a sense of things would turn out positively. Even with polio and all the other stuff he grappled with, right? He never lost that sense of optimism, of hopefulness. And it's, men are not prisoners of fate, but prisoners of their own minds. Isn't that great? I mean, that's, it's somebody that's certainly a lot of privilege in his life, but also struggle. And that's, again, one of the themes I'll touch on tonight quite a bit is consistently with all these people, there were struggles that they grew from that prepared them to lead, I think, in a lot of ways. And I'm big on struggle. So any of you that would like to sort of wrestle with some of the cognitive, stuff around optimism and so forth, David Burns wrote a book called Feeling Good, the New Mood Therapy. That was really helpful to me, dealing with depression, especially throughout my life, and certainly is prevalent in my family. But I found like changing the way I thought about events really significantly impacted my mood. And what you'll see oftentimes with good leaders is that they have an optimistic framework. They have a way of interpreting events, seeing things that, okay, we can do this. Yeah, it's a setback, but okay, we've done this before, let's go. And I think that's one of the sort of consistent characteristics, whether it's Shackleton, Lincoln, any of those folks. There was always that ability. What we find oftentimes when I work with folks is they'll use some of these patterns that make things worse, almost. We overgeneralize, like my mother, right? Everything, my whole life, my ship never came in, was her famous line, It's like, okay, I mean, I get that, but once in a while, no, never, And each of these, I think the mental filtering, it wouldn't matter. I'll never forget my mom. So I have my mom and her three sisters, and they all live in South Jersey, or lived in South Jersey. So we all grew up together. And every Friday night, sometimes Saturday night too, they play cards, pinochle. And I remember on my Aunt Grace one time, she passed out. It was really hot, and she was a little dramatic anyway. But she passed out, and her head hit the table, the kitchen table, as she's sitting there like this. And my mother's sliding the cards under her head. Like I said, Mom, I don't know. I mean, you think Aunt Grace needs some water or something? Oh, she's dramatic. That's always what she does. Like that. Like the funniest thing. Come on, Grace, it's your turn, That's my mom. Anyway, isn't that funny? Now you look back on this stuff, you're like, what was I thinking? But for her, there was always a sort of a lens that she interpreted things through. And that, by the way, again, is what you look for in leaders. So when we interview people, especially for leadership roles at Gonzaga, I've been on a bunch of search committees. I'll often ask the question, tell me about a challenge you faced and what you did with it. You know, what I'm looking for is this. I'm looking for how they interpreted the event, the challenge. One of the people that we ended up hiring, actually, she said, well, I'm not sure what you're looking for, but in high school, you know, I was a volleyball player and I blew out my left knee, and my coach said that I was done. My career was over, and she goes, you know, I really wanted to play collegiately, and he said, no, sorry, that's it, you know. She said, so I worked pretty hard at it, got a walk-on at a college. My senior year, I was team captain, most valuable player in college. So is that what you mean? I'm like, you're hired, you know. And that is exactly how she is to work with. You give her anything. She goes, all right, I'll figure it out. It's always like that. You know, it's that optimistic can-do thing, give me a challenge. And so that's always sort of a pretty consistent thread I look for. Part of it is narrative. Some of you have heard me speak about storytelling before and stuff, but I really believe we have like a narrative, a belief about ourselves that we hold on to. And that's often what you're trying to detect when you interview someone. And those of you that are parents, I think what I've always done with my kids is listen for their narrative. How do they view the world? Is it hopeful, hopeless? Is it a can-do thing, or do they feel like victims like my mom? You know, that kind of thing. I'll never forget, I was driving, I have two sons, Jacob and Matthew. Jacob just turned 40. Matthew's 38. They're both single, by the way, if you know anybody. So, it'd be great. Really would be, you know. Anyway, so I think Jacob was in first or second grade. I was driving him home from school. They're both in the back seat of the van. You know, we're driving. And I said, Jacob, you were going to talk to that girl today, you know, at lunch recess or something. He goes, oh, yeah, I talked to her. I said, how'd it go, you know? And he goes, well, not good, Dad. You know, I went up and talked to her. I said, hey, do you want to be friends? And she said, no, you're ugly and stupid. Get away from me. And I'm like gripping the steering wheel of the car like, you know, father drives across playground, runs down second grade girl. Joe, get a grip. I said, so, what'd you do? You know, and what I'm listening for is his narrative, right? How he views the world. And he goes, well, I just said, you're going to miss out playing with a really cool kid. And I walked away. And I'm like, oh, thank God. And to this day, that's how he's been. You know, to this day, he does gang intervention work down in Los Angeles. And it's hard work, you know. I did some stuff with him last summer. And I'm like, Jacob, these are all like Bloods and Crips, real Bloods and Crips, you know? He goes, yeah, they're cool though, Dad. Come on over. And I'm like, okay. You know, but that's him. And he's really high impact with them. And they just really respect him. You know, it's pretty cool. But our narrative is kind of what we're listening for. And every president I'll talk about tonight has a narrative that's about possibility and hope and so forth. Some years ago, I went back to, my in-laws are from South Dakota originally, then moved to LA, but they were farmers in the 20s and 30s. And we went back for a family reunion in Northville, South Dakota. And Vince, my wife's father, who passed away a couple years ago, he said, you know, Joe, back, and I'm from New Jersey, what do I know? And he goes, back, you know, in the day, we have always had a rope from the barn to the farmhouse in case there was a blizzard. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Why? And he goes, well, whiteouts. I mean, you get lost, you could die out here. I'm like, okay, now it's real, you know. And I think of our narrative kind of like that rope, or your story is like that, you know, how I view myself in the world. And that's often what I sort of, as a metaphor kind of, but it's something to think about. What's your narrative? And then listen for that in people that are, example, running for office, or even these people tonight. So, final thing around self-reflection is intentionality. What do I want to see happen? Being able to articulate that. Lyndon Johnson, I didn't know a lot about him, you know, grew up in the 50s and 60s, but, you know, about the Civil Rights Act and so forth. But there was a clarity he had about the Civil Rights Act, and it was really about that intentionality. Anybody should be able to answer the question, what do I want to see happen here? You know, this is something I've had to work on in my life, because my voice as a little kid wasn't always valued or heard or ever encouraged. So what I said didn't really matter to anybody. So for me, I had to build that sense of, what do I want? Like even driving to work every morning, it's like, okay, come on, Joe, what do you want to get done today? Let's pick three things. You know, it's like living intentionally. And I think these people are the same way. There's a lot of intentionality there. And one of the things the four, I think, have that Kearns Goodwin talks about is that ambition or drive, and I think that's about intentionality. It's a clarity about this is what I want to do or want to accomplish. And look different. These are all pictures of when they were young, and I'll finish with a picture of them sort of a little bit later in their career and the wear and tear of leadership on them. But each of them had a drive, a passion, and that's the intentionality thing. Because like a lot of times we don't trust people running for office, like, what's your motive here? What's the deal? That kind of a thing. And kind of what I ask is, tell me what you want to do. Why? Why is this important to you? What do you want to see happen? That's always my question to folks. And in fact, in a leadership role, it's always number one. The second dimension of emotional intelligence is self-regulation. So in other words, how do people manage emotions, stress, anger, sadness, anxiety, all that stuff? Some do it really well. My boss that ripped up the receipts threw them at me, not so good. Others, like Ned Bogar, the car dealership guy, he would just sit and cry and we'd talk, and then he was fine. Fired that used car salesman. It was great. But each president, I think, has had to find ways to manage themselves in ways that wouldn't, and this is an important thing about self-regulation. If you do it right, if you do it in a healthy way, people shouldn't have to adjust around you. You figured out what do you need to do to take care of yourself? What do you need to do to manage this frustration, this anger? The boss that threw the receipts, he would dump on somebody and then he would be fine. And so you never wanted to be the next person. Everybody would tiptoe around him. Other people, it's like they find ways of doing it that I think are a lot healthier, quite honestly. So think about what you do to kind of, and this is like a concept I'll teach a lot, intention versus impact. Most people have pretty good intentions when they're in a leadership role, but their impact is often discrepant. I remember I was talking to this leader once, and this guy I was consulting with, and he was trying to do a performance review with somebody, and I said, well, I'll just observe, because, yeah, great, I'm going to motivate this guy. I'm like, oh, okay, great. So this top sales guy comes in, and he's like, you're once again our number one guy, blah, 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 blah. And then and the sales guy turns to me and goes, and here it comes. And this guy that was my friend in charge, he's like, but you can always do better, when I was in your seat. And you just saw the guy deflate right in front of me. And so he laughed, and I was talking to my friend, and I said, what was that? And he goes, well, Joe, you got to motivate people. I'm like, yeah, that's not it. You just lost, like right now, the guy's looking at his resume back in his desk, intention and impact. And oftentimes, this is one of the biggest struggles leaders have, is how do you ensure that your intention matches your actual impact on people? This is what's so hard for me, at least, about any kind of public leadership these days, is you're working with the media, you're really having to create an image that is aligned with what you believe and who you are. And managing impression, managing how you land on people is really a critical part of this thing. And that's, to me at least, that's what makes it so difficult, quite honestly. So again, managing our emotions so that they are aligned with what we want to accomplish with people, that's a huge part of this, in my mind at least. And then finally, self-regulation is not self-control. It's not the same thing. If I blow up, my impact, it sort of separates from my intention. I lose people. So what do I got to do to make sure that doesn't happen? I remember there was one woman I had in class, and we were talking about this, and I said, so what do you do, to manage stress, anxiety? And she's like a 35-year-old professional. She goes, yeah, I do push-ups. I'm like, okay. Like where? She goes, in the office. If we're in a meeting, I just go out in the hallway and do 50, and then I come back in, and I'm like, okay, that's great. Let's keep talking. Let's look at some other sort of ways of managing our emotions, if you will. When people don't regulate well, you'll see it right away. They're off. They're blowing up at people. They're pushing people away. People that don't regulate well don't handle feedback, critical feedback very well, or failure, right? One of the things you'll see in the Shackleton story in the Endurance Expedition is a lot of setbacks. And his ability to manage himself, to regulate, was key to keeping his crew hopeful. Because there were times when, everything was just hopeless in a lot of ways. And somehow, and he had really bad back, and so he's constantly struggling with just being in pain. But knowing that if he crumbled, if his sort of presentation crumbled and hopefulness disappeared, there'd be suicide, there'd be guys just splitting apart, mutiny, all that kind of stuff. So self-regulation for leaders, I think, is a pretty critical capacity. So, and you'll see it sometimes. I mean, under stress, how do people manage themselves? And again, that's a question I ask when we interview people. Like, tell me what you're like under stress, a conflict, whatever it might be. What do you do? Where does it go? I was just talking to someone I was working with in the medical field, and they just had a really tough situation. And I said, so where does that go? He goes, dark places. That's all I can tell you. It just goes to dark places. And I'm like, and it's like there's no, I think it probably works okay for him, but I don't know, So again, actually, red light, green light, that was something that Gary Livingston taught me years ago, if he remembers, because I said, what do you do? How do you sort of manage yourself? And he's like, red light, green light, and it was just always a way to kind of know, like, red light, got to step away, don't blow up, walk away, that kind of thing. It was really helpful, actually, so thanks, Gary. And then green light is, okay, let's talk about this. Let's work through it in some way, shape, or form. But again, watch for how people regulate their emotions. And then finally, empathy. I think that's one of the keys to great leadership. Theodore Roosevelt watched his mother die of typhoid fever and then immediately had to go upstairs and see his wife die of complications from childbirth. Tough, right? And so what do you do with that? And for him, there was a sense of, that's when he left and went out west and, did the whole cowboy thing for a couple of years, but almost rediscovered himself. Who was he? A lot of, and, Lincoln. I mean, all these people struggled. They suffered loss in some way, shape, or form. So, but I think the gift of it, if you can get through that loss, if you can struggle through that, the gift in the end is empathy for other people that are also struggling. And for me, at least, and this is something I did not know about Lyndon Johnson. He spent a year teaching Mexican American kids on the Texas-Mexico border. Really profoundly shaped he was a principal, he was a coach, he did all this stuff, teach them. And a lot of people didn't know about that, but it really shaped his view of the compassion in a way that he had for people. So I think empathy, again, we go through stuff in our lives. And one of the exercises I have my students, graduate and undergraduates, do is do a timeline, birth to current date. On that timeline, what have been the struggles in your life? What gifts have they given you? They leave scars, they always do. I always tell people, I've got this scar that I got when I was 6 years old, jumping over my Aunt Grace's fence. And scars don't disappear, they're there. But they're also sources of strength for us in a lot of ways and allow us sometimes to come out of it, as Sister Joan Chittister says in Transformed by Struggle, the great book, with a new heart, with a new perspective in the world. But coming through it and coming out of it is hard to do, I think. You know what I mean? So, so empathy, when I think about it, I always think of Columbo. It's so great to talk to you guys, because I'll put that up there, and my students like, I have no idea who that is. Why are you showing us this crumbled up old detective guy? And I'm like, well, you had to see the show, It was 70s, right? Wasn't it? Yeah. So, but I always liked his approach, somehow he always solved the crime. But empathy is something we can learn, and sometimes, we're off. But it's like trying to get close. Am I close to this? And it's not sympathy. Sympathy is something different. And sympathy is a way of feeling bad for someone, but not really engaging. Empathy requires something here. It means you lean into their experience. So you understand what it must be like to be them. I remember some years ago there was an individual at Gonzaga whose son was early 20s, about the same age as my kids at the time, and her son went in for, he had flu symptoms at the hospital. Next morning he died. And I remember going to the funeral, and she and I were pretty close, and I looked at her in the church, it was St. Al's, and it's like I couldn't say anything. It was too close for me. It was like, wow. And I just remember stepping back almost. And about 6 months later, I went down to her office and said, I'm sorry. I couldn't be there. I was just too hard for me to be close. And she said, oh, I get it, and yikes. Okay. Oh my God, somebody's breaking into the library. Once again, just so in case you missed it the first time through. So takeaways, as I sort of looked at the lives of these four, persistence and resilience, the ability to bounce back, the ability to push through, huge. Empathy, I think people without empathy in a leadership role, they can fake it, they can make it look like they have empathy, but when they have it, because you feel understood. As Oprah Winfrey, this woman I work with, she met Oprah some years ago, and she said, well, what is it that you've learned from all the people you've interviewed and met and that kind of thing? What's your takeaway? She goes, everybody wants to be seen. Everybody wants to be seen. And I think that's really true. And I think that's the empathy part. When you're with somebody, you want to know that, yeah, they see you there. Common goal or vision. And I always, teach people 3 things that unite a group: a common ordeal, a common enemy, or a common vision will bring groups together, right? What we would hope for leaders is that they craft a vision that inspires us, that brings us together, that calls us to be something even more. The common enemy is a little easier in a lot of ways. And like Shackleton's group, the common ordeal united those men forever, And I think back living in Spokane since, 1975. I think of Ice Storm, Firestorm, Mount St. Helens, and so forth, like those ordeals really brought the community together. And I think good leadership will once again sort of bring us together, but hopefully around a common vision or goal. And that ain't easy. That's not easy to craft, but it relies certainly on empathy. Failure and struggle, I think we often overlook the value and the gifts that those offer us. You don't be afraid to lean into those, and we're all flawed, we're all imperfect, but I think the ability to kind of get through stuff and come out of it, again, with a new heart is great. And finally, relational skills. I think for presidential leadership, the ability to build coalitions, to be empathic, to connect with people. Recently, I had, when was this? About a year ago, I get an email from George Nethercutt. And he goes, Joe, I want to meet you. I heard you're doing all this stuff on leadership. And I wrote back, I said, okay. So we met for lunch, and I'm thinking, I guess I got to be honest, because I kind of knew Tom Foley a little bit. We would debate over the years and talk about things. And so we sit down, the Bulldog at Gonzaga, George and I, and a colleague, and I said, all right, I want to be honest with you. I still have a Tom Foley sign in my garage, and that's all right. I like Tom. He was a good guy, like that. And we just had this long conversation that we met each other again about a month ago at an event, and we're talking. He goes, that's Joe there. We disagree, but we respect each other. We get along really well, don't we, Joe? I'm like, uh-huh. He was really genuinely a nice guy and just a very pleasant, it was just a fun, like a healing almost thing. And I miss that civility sometimes, and I think that ability to foster good relations with people across the aisle, across an issue, whatever it might be, is kind of critical. So with that, so I promised people I wouldn't go more than an hour, so I'll shut up now because I've talked to you the whole doggone time. My apologies. But questions, thoughts, and I've given you like a fire hose of things here. So, but I didn't want you to feel cheated, like you had to come out tonight and come to this thing. Don't feel ripped off. So, thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, I have something that related to the story you were talking about. I lived in Africa for 17 years, and
Where at?
in Nigeria, Liberia, and Sierra Leone,
Okay.
3 different countries. And my son came here when he was 14, my oldest son. And so we were at Iowa State University, and he got on the bus, and he's biracial. My first husband was Nigerian. And this girl said, he can't sit next to him. And so I said, Amika, I said, well, what did you do? And he said, well, I looked her up and down, and I sat down right next to her. And so he says, Mom, he said, you know what? And this was after about 4 months being here. Americans just don't know how to behave right. And I thought that was so interesting, that position of, I think a lot of immigrants might feel that way. You know, that if they're discriminated against, you know, they already have within them a feeling of being okay, and it's somebody else's that's a problem, not them, when they meet discrimination. But it reminded me of, when your story reminded me of that. I thought it was so interesting.
Well, and over the years, we've had a lot of African students in our school. And we have a PhD program in leadership, and got a lot of African students. I got all these gifts all around my office from Africa, you know. And there's a warmth, and I do this because they always hold my hand, and they're rubbing it as they're talking to me, you know. Oh, Joe, you good person, you good, you know. It's like, thank you, you know. And they really are. I mean, it's just a genuine warmth, and they don't have a lot, but they'll bring something back for me always, you know. And whatever, some handmade thing, you know. It's just a cool, if you ever come to my office, you can see a whole bunch of stuff, you know. But it is quite true. I mean, that's been my experience for sure. So thanks. Yeah. What else?
You talked about, just thank you for being here, by the way.
Oh.
You talked about the 3 keys: self-reflection, self-regulation, and empathy. If a leader does not possess all 3, and it obviously would be tough for all of us to have all 3 of those in high forms.
Right.
What would you say is the key, the most important of those 3 to have?
For me at least, you know, the self-awareness. I mean, so many leaders I struggle with are people that don't know what they don't know, you know, about themselves. And so a lot of blind spots. I don't know if there was a thing some of you might remember from your undergrad years or masters, even the Johari window, where it's like these 4 quadrants, and, you know, one of those is kind of blind spots. And a lot of people, and there's a defensiveness about it. There's not like an openness, you know. And so a willingness to acknowledge it, you know, I don't know. You know, like, I don't know everything about myself, and please, openness to feedback. Like, years ago, I did a presentation at a conference called on the learning leader, and for me, that posture of always openness and learning is really key, because you can always grow. You know, you can learn stuff, but if you're defensive about it, and anybody that challenges you, brush them away, that blind spot's going to kill you, you know. And there's a thing too, and like in leadership, we always say that the thing that gets you to the top will cause you to fail when you get there, you know. And so that drive and ambition's great, you know. Wow, this person's a born leader, you know. And then they get up there and they have these blind spots that become glaring. And the further up you move, right, the more, I hate to say it this way, but your rear end gets exposed the further you go to the flagpole, right? And so, and I think in leadership, it's really true, you know. If these blind spots aren't something you look at, or at least open to hearing about, boy, you're going to struggle. You know what I mean? So I think last fall I was talking to a group of undergrad business students. I was covering for somebody, and I was just about done. This girl goes, "What's your favorite characteristic about yourself?" And I said, "What?" I don't know where I came up with this. And I said, "Curiosity. I just think I'm always curious. I want to learn more about myself, what my possibility is, my potential, but also just what's out there. You know what I mean?" And I think there has to be kind of a willingness to, like Lincoln. I always felt with Lincoln there was always this sort of interest or curiosity about other people, you know, and I think you have to have that. So I think the not knowing what you don't know and being defensive about that will be a Achilles heel. Empathy you can develop, you know, not a lot, but a little bit. Regulation, you learn techniques for it, or you have somebody that works with you. But this sort of blind spot and not being interested in closing that is, for me, a pretty frightening thing, you know.
Joe, how do you explain with Lyndon Johnson his ability to rise the country to pass the civil rights legislation, and then not too long after that, the tragedy of Vietnam?
Yeah.
And so could you share a little bit about that and where you think
Yeah.
where did Johnson, you know, in a sense, go wrong?
Yeah, and once again, I'm not an historian, a presidential historian, but my sense of it was always this growing sort of mindset. And you remember, I mean, at least I was in high school in the 60s, and I remember everybody talking about the communist threat, and it seemed legitimate. I mean, it was like, oh, okay, I guess this sort of makes sense. You know, they're going to come down and take over, and Johnson, I don't know what his advisors, the interpretation of that, but it felt like a creeping, the boiled frog thing, you know what I mean? And you put a frog in, water and you turn it up. I always hate that image, but it's true. And, it'll stay there and then it'll just die, and that's always the sense I had with that. Whereas the Civil Rights Act, it felt like that experience I showed you with Johnson, that was a commitment he had and something that was really, I think, important to him. I don't know with Vietnam, and I'd be curious to get other perspectives on it that are more informed than mine, but the advising, the reality of the time, and then it just sort of seemed to get away from him,
I did a paper for you on Lyndon Johnson, as a matter of fact. And what you talked about when he was a teacher in that small
Yeah.
Texas Mexican town, it formed him so much that he was driven to provide infrastructure when he was in office, in whatever office he was in. So he would build roads, or he would whatever, schools.
Yeah.
And that was part of what he thought he could do in Vietnam, is give them the great society. And they didn't want it, but it took forever to accept that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You talked about willingness and openness and defensiveness, and all the time you were saying that, I was thinking of listening. How important is listening? What's the relationship of listening to empathy?
Yeah, they're key. And yeah, I couldn't say it any better, honestly, other than that. The ability to be present to somebody and truly listen. Like when I teach storytelling, one of the techniques I teach is hard listening. And it's just that you've got to take off all the clatter, and to really hear this person, not just what they're saying, but their perspective, where they're coming from. And that to me is what empathy is about. It's not saying, wow, that's too bad, I'm really sorry. That's not empathy. Empathy is about an ability to understand what it must be like. And you can only do that by listening, I think. So, yeah, I wouldn't know how else to punctuate it more, but you're absolutely right,
Do you think listening can actually mollify another person's defensiveness? And maybe dissolve some of that opinionated kind of attack kind of thing that you get from people, something that I get from people?
Yeah, we all get. Yeah. That's a great question. And what I try to do is understand, like, wow, that must be really hard for you. Like I try to go deeper than, I don't know how else to say this, but like the opinion and like what's driving that and the fear, the anger, whatever it might be, and go, so help me understand. And I use that phrase a lot actually with people. Help me understand this, because it sounds right now like I'm getting sort of this fire hose of anger and frustration, but I know there's something deeper than that, and I'm not always good at it. I just blew up recently at my wife's cousin, and sorry. No, okay, get this. So we're at this party, right? And so I'm sitting there talking to my son and my wife's cousin, who's a cool guy. He's a cop in LA and been through all kinds of stuff. My son does all this gang intervention work, so it's really good conversation. And cousin Eddie comes in and he's like this slick, kind of older, anyway, and he sits down next to me and goes, hey, don't you think, and he just, I'm like, what? And he like, no, like, foundation, no research, no nothing. Don't you think we got to get rid of all these people in the country that are, I'm like, what? And I just laid into him, and finally a couple of people came over and said, hey, everybody, why don't we take a break here? This is at my mother-in-law's house, And my son and the guy that's a cop, they're like, Joe, just go in the kitchen. Like, this guy's an asshole. It's just, and I just lost it, And later, my wife's cousin comes over and she goes, listen, forget about him. And he puts his arm around me. He goes, I'm really sorry. I want to apologize, And then the next day, right, my mother-in-law's in this assisted living place, and Eddie shows up. He's a guitarist and he plays for all the people at the assisted living place. So my mother-in-law's like, oh my God, Eddie is the best person ever. So I didn't do a very good job of listening, was my point. And I just didn't. I don't know what caught me that day. Because my son said, are you okay? I'm like, no, he's an idiot. I mean, he hasn't read anything. He doesn't know anything. Anyway, So I don't always do a good job of listening. But I want to finish the Lyndon Johnson thing, too. And I guess for me, that's an excellent, Ginny's point was really like his image of it, it was almost like he wasn't prepared to deal with the other issues that I think sort of were emergent there. That wouldn't you say, I don't know, that I don't think he was ready for that in a lot of ways, you know, unprepared. Yeah, and it's always like one of my favorite movies. Oh my God, it's after 8. Churchill, Darkest Hour. Have you seen that? Isn't that well done?
Yeah.
You know, and it was kind of like some people are good for one segment of history. You know, nothing great before. It's like Shackleton. You know, nothing great before, nothing great after. But you know, Shackleton was a terrible husband, terrible father, all that stuff. But for those 2 years, he led something that inspires and continues to inspire all of us, and inspire all of us. Just powerful, I think. So it's just, sometimes it's just a limited window that we have where we can impact things. You know what I mean? So
Joe, maybe wrap up for tonight with what was told to us earlier with Peg, with the interaction and holding accountable our leaders that are out there, and you've given us a certain amount of metrics to gauge them by. You may not be the best person given that last story.
Wait a minute.
How do we take those metrics, interact with our leaders out there who we feel may have their ladder leaned up against the wrong wall?
yeah, that's a great analogy, actually. It's like I think asking the questions and that I try to model a little bit like when we interview people. Like some of those questions, like watching how they answer those, but more importantly, how they behave. You know, is there a consistent, like what I was trying to do tonight is give you a lens, like a way to, and there's other lenses, right? There's policy, there's this, there's image, all the other stuff. But this was like one little lens, I think, in terms of how he managed himself. We call self-leadership. So it's something I look for because I find it pretty intriguing and telling. But that's kind of how I would sort of just look at it through that lens in a way. You know, how do they manage themselves under stress? Do you see blow-ups? Are they intentional or not? Do they regulate pretty well? I guess, yeah, that's my best answer, I think, because for me it's informative. And that's what I look for local leaders and others, is that ability to manage themselves in a way that's even, but not just bland, but there's passion there and there's a sense of direction and vision. And vision's really a critical thing that a lot of people struggle with. You know what I mean? And that's something I think I've been looking at now with this, the next election, is how many people have a vision that inspires, that has a sense of, I feel pulled, you know what I mean? And that comes from their own intention for sure, but also a result of being empathic, you know, and listening to people over time and getting the sense of this is what I think people want, you know, and I just don't always see that very well articulated. So it's just interesting to me. I mean, that's kind of how I think about it anyway. So, yeah, I know we got to wrap up. So that's a really poor answer, but that's probably the best. That's the way I think about it anyway.
You've got till 8:30.
Oh, I do. Oh, not everybody thinks that though. There's a lot of people think that. Yeah.
Question. Thank you for sharing that, little thing with Cousin Addie. Because I can find myself doing the same thing, and a lot of us in this room could do the same thing as well. Because we all have our value system.
Yeah.
And when somebody steps on them, it's like,
Yeah.
And, like
Yeah.
the red light, green light, step back.
Mm-hmm.
That's the time to step back, but it's really hard sometimes.
Yeah, I'd say
But
so.
he sort of says, well, maybe you're not the best. I said, no, you're human. That's a part of who we are. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, it's just, I felt so bad. I still do. I'm going to see him. My mother-in-law's 100th birthday is in May. Eddie's playing at it. And so, I mean, yeah. So I got to go. So anyway, I'm sure he'll take requests. I don't know what I'll request though. So.
I guess as a person steps more and more into greater degrees of leadership or responsibility, where there's more external pressure and all those kinds of things, are there best practices for continuing to grow in these things, in self-awareness and all those kinds of things, especially as you take on more and you're feeling that external pressure and responding perhaps, or being tempted to respond perhaps more impulsively?
Yeah. When I was for about 5 years, I was the dean of our school at Gonzaga. Didn't want it. The vice president says, I want you to, And so, okay. What I noticed almost immediately was self-regulation was the biggest challenge. I'd have faculty come into me and lay into me about something, and then others had come in and their dog died and they're crying and they want support, and somebody else comes in and I thought, whoa, like, how do I manage this in a way that I don't punish the next person? You know what I mean? And that's I would walk down the hall in the morning and I'd say hi to everybody, and I literally would be like, she hates saying goodbye to her 2 little boys first thing in the morning. She'll be crying her off. She is usually. Somebody else just talked to her niece who she really misses because she lives in another city. This person is struggling because her husband's not around. This guy, I would walk down the hall and be aware of all this stuff, But I think that's part of the empathy piece. But I had to find ways to renew myself and stay present. And I don't know if I did it very well. I had a very painful, maybe about a month ago, 2 months ago. I'm leaving Gonzaga at the end of this year, right? So 25 years. And so my wife and I were talking about it, and she said, well, I just want to tell you that, when you were the dean for those 5 years, she said the boys and I talked about it over Christmas. They said they didn't talk to you for almost 5 years. Like, you were always on your phone. You're always checking emails. You're always, no matter where we were, I'd be in the car on vacation talking to somebody about some issue back at school. And they said that it was almost like you weren't there, and I thought, and that was hard. That was a really painful thing to hear. And I'm sure we'll have more conversations about it and stuff, but I just didn't know how to manage all of that. And I think I didn't realize, as much as I teach leadership all these years, right? I don't think I realized how hard, like, all the pressures would be, and what are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about that? I remember one point, one department wrote a letter of no confidence, right, to the vice president about me. And I was like, oh, crap. It's like 2-hour meeting, fighting every allegation. And they're like, you're right. We're sorry. I'm like, well, it just went to the vice president. I got to go explain this now. Well, I guess maybe we misspoke. Maybe, and it was, so you have that. And then you have another faculty member that's really upset, struggling, and kind of that was like, this was hard for me. So self-regulation really was a big sort of awareness for me, how important that is. And so I remember I do triathlons, and so I remember doing these little ones, sprint ones, for years, and I became dean. Suddenly I'm doing 70.3s, and just because I needed to work out more, and because I couldn't find another way to deal with it. I can go home every night and get drunk. That would, okay, that sort of works for a while, but long term, what am I going to do to sustain my health and presence and all that stuff? And so that was a challenge. So I think self-regulation, learning how to handle painful as well as positive emotions and stuff, I think is really key. And then just self-awareness. What am I feeling right now? What's going on for me? And like I tell people, when you're thinking about building sort of your level of self-reflection practice, it's almost like sitting by a river. When the emotions float down, you don't have to jump in and grab them, but be aware of them. Like, wow, I'm really angry right now. What's that about? Rather than acting it out,
What's your name again? I missed it at the beginning.
Joe, Albert.
Joe
Yeah. Gary, talk about the red light, green light.
Joe, you talked about the listening and the empathy and the characteristics and all of the self-improvements. What about decisiveness in leadership?
Yeah, great. What do you think? Because you've been, Gary Livingston, by the way, former superintendent of schools. He was the one that taught me about the red light, green light. So.
Look, I just think, these were all leaders who had the soft skills.
Mm-hmm.
They also made tough decisions after they did the soft skill stuff.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty important. And you picked 4 who were very decisive.
Right.
Others had the soft skills, but not the. And we have some who got the hard skills, but not the soft skills. So decisiveness, is that?
A couple of things I would say off the top of my head. I'd be open to other people's thoughts too. One is about intentionality and knowing what you want to see happen. And I think for a lot of, there's often a clarity that any leader, not just these, but any leader has a sense of values and No, that's not okay with me. Sorry. You know, and there's a decisiveness, a clarity they seem to have about where they stand on issues and around values especially. That's part of it. And then the second thing I think too is self-regulation, is making a decision and living with it. And I think that's hard. I think there are times, and every leader I've ever taught, we have this wonderful board that at our school, it's mostly CEO folks, and we've talked about this a little bit about decision making and decisiveness, and they said, you know, you make your best decision and you move forward and you make that the right decision, and you do your best is all you can do, you know. But then you have to live with that feeling, you know, of regret or doubt and all that stuff, and that's the regulation piece to me of decisiveness is, you know, I like one of the hardest decisions first-time managers have to make is when they let go of someone, you know, and very tough, and you'll just see people agonize and try to save them in performance reviews, and well, we'll give them another 6 months trial, blah, blah, blah. And there's times when it's just best for the person, best for the organization to make a decision like that, right? And so they do, and but then they have to manage their affect afterwards. I feel like a jerk, I feel like I really messed this person's life up, you know, that kind of thing. And almost everybody goes through that. And so I would say, Gary, for me at least, it's intentionality, clarity about what you believe, what you think, and then living with it and managing it. So you don't beat yourself up. I mean, that's one of the, I think, most common things I've seen is successful leaders tend not to be like beating themselves up over things. There's almost an amnesia. You make a decision, you move forward. You know, if that makes sense. I don't know. Others? What do you think? I mean, that's a great question.
Well, Joe, there's a great quote. Warren Buffett quoted his mother, and one of her things he kept telling all the kids was, show up, pay attention, tell the truth, and don't own the outcome.
Yeah, yeah.
And do your best.
Yeah.
And don't own the outcome. So that if you do all of those things, then the outcome's going to be whatever it's going to be.
Yep.
And you can have that closure.
Yeah. And there is something about that. You know, you don't own it and let it sort of belabor you over time and haunt you, I think. And no, that's the tough one, you know, and I've worked with like physicians that have had to make really tough calls sometimes and painful stuff. And what do you do with that? You know, where does that go? And again, hopefully you find a way to deal with it. But decisiveness, I do think, Gary, it is about clarity, you know, values, vision, what I want to see happen, and then go from there. I really struggled with it. I mean, when I was the dean, I mean, there were some things that were tricky for us, you know, and then other things are like, no, this is pretty clear to me. Yeah, bam, you know. But that often came from my own experience too. Like, I had been down that road before, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah. Bill Williams, I don't know if you remember, Bill and Judy Williams at Telek, great couple, wonderful. And I remember talking to Bill one time about deciding this or that, and it's like, Joe, you can't chase every rabbit down the road. All right, that's helpful, you know, and I kind of was, you know, and I thought, yeah, fair enough, you know, you got to make a decision.
When you were talking about interviewing people and asking them questions about how they deal with stress or how they handle this or that, don't you think sometimes people really see themselves as different than others see them?
Mm-hmm.
So if you were to ask them that question, they would have this perfect answer, maybe something that you would want to hear, that you would say you're hired.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I hope people rehearse and practice before interviews.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of expect that, you know. But I've tried to, with questions, create something a little messy so that they'd have to at least reveal some sort of struggle or something. Like the old question, you know, strengths, weaknesses. Tell us about a strength, tell us about a weakness. And inevitably, well, I don't really like to focus on weakness. That's just me. I'm a very positive person. I'm like, really? You know, and that's when I stopped asking that question, actually. And so I went more.
I bet if you asked your mother what she was like, we probably wouldn't hear what you said to us.
No, she would talk about her cooking, which she was an outstanding cook. That's probably what she would talk about. And then she also worked at nights she was a cafeteria cook for 37 years in high school, and then at night she'd work in the rectory cooking food for the priests and stuff. And she was just outstanding. I mean, best cook ever. I mean, my poor wife has always had to hear this, and she's a good cook. She really is, and a really nice person. But my mom was the cook. You know, she just kind of was. So I think she would probably say that, but she would more point to the reality of her victimhood. Well, yeah, but you know, it hasn't been easy for me, and you know, it'd be kind of like that.
Do you think you're born with your narrative, or somewhat?
I think, you know, in that whole attachment phase, the first couple of years of life, you sort of get a sense of, you get some wiring, you know, like how you are in the world. And then over time it's been very interesting teaching storytelling, because like freshman, sophomore kids at Gonzaga, they aren't quite ready to really look at it well, you know, but seniors are kind of like really looking at themselves, because they're ready to take that abyss, into the, you know, that big leap, you know, into, oh my God, post-college. But sophomores are still sort of figuring it out. And it's very interesting in my class Wednesday nights, I've got like 25, 30 kids. I've got 2 sophomores. And they always wait for the seniors to share experiences. And they're like, oh, okay. You know, and then they can share something that's difficult or challenging. But the seniors have a better sort of access to some of the struggles, because I think they have a chance to really work on their narrative. But a lot of times we don't realize we have one, you know, and until you get a little, that senior year of college, junior, senior year, early adulthood thing. I think that's when you really start to say, is this really what I want for myself? You know, that kind of a thing. And the narrative drives it. I mean, the narrative is such a powerful thing in terms of how we view ourselves in the world. You know, it's just...
Because when we're picking our leaders, we don't really, I mean, we've seen some really bad behavior in leaders as time has gone by, but it's kind of almost like I work for a group of physicians, and these people would think these physicians were just so wonderful. Well, I knew them.
Yeah. And there it is. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And I didn't really say this, but it's like oftentimes we assume the brightest person will make the best leader, or the best physician, or the best salesperson, or the best nurse will make the best nurse manager, whatever. And it's a different skill set. And I don't think people realize, like, good teachers will make good principals. No, they won't. Not all of them. I mean, you have to have a certain aspiration for leadership, you know, and too often we get somebody that tries to lead the way that got them there, you know, that made them the best salesperson. Now they're going to have that drive and push, and that's how they're going to lead, and it's a disaster, you know. And so it's really hard to kind of help people realize the thing that got you there will cause you to fail once you get there. And so learning the different skill set, they have to be open to that. And with, like, we just started a program for University of Washington has a med school on our campus now. And so we've been working with the faculty in the med school to teach leadership to the first and second years. And so the first time, they're all in this, there's about this many of their first and second years in the room, and I said, wow, it's weird to be in a room where you realize you're the least smart person, right? And I'd say something like that, it's a self-deprecating, haha, and they're like, uh-huh. Okay, so here we go, you know, a long road. But they assume, since they're smart and they got into med school, that the leadership's just, you know, it's just like that kind of, and it's like so different. And very few physicians make good leaders, you know, it's just a different thing. So, yeah.
So to that end, when we're, you know, put in a position where we're selecting leaders, how do you vet this kind of thing? Like, how do you vet, I mean, for emotional intelligence?
Yeah, that's a great question. The vision thing for sure is something. I want to know that their vision is a product of empathy and listening and a sense of understanding, not just selling us on something, but in fact, it's something that has come from a lot of time being with people and understanding what drives them. That's one. And over time, these campaigns are got to be painful. And in terms of self-regulation, you'll look for, you know, drop balls kind of, you know what I mean? They blow up or they lose it or this or that. Or you hear from campaign insiders what people really like. And that's the self-regulation thing I think I'm looking for as well, you know. And then things like optimism and hope. like what's their interpretive thing? Is it really a common enemy that people are preaching, or do they really inspire us with a common vision and a sense of hope and the best in us? Because I think ultimately people want that. I do, I believe that. About 2 years ago, Craig Meidel, we were interviewing the finalists. Some of you may have been there that night. For the police chief, right? And so I get a call from the mayor's office saying, "Hey, Joe, could you moderate the discussion?" I'm like, "Oh, crap." You just know there's going to be a lot of community people there, probably outbursts and people yelling and all this stuff. Like, oh, God. So we get there and the mayor's introducing me and the finalists are up on the stage and all this stuff. And the woman I'm with, and she's going to do it with me, the mayor introduces me and she goes, "Joe, tell a story." I'm like, "What?" Mayor hands me the microphone. And what I did was just talk about my experience living in Spokane in the best way, from Mount St. Helens to Firestorm, Ice Storm, Hoop Fest, Bloomsday, all the things that Spokane ought to be very proud of, that they've either created or gotten through together as a community. And I just remember people's faces looking at the crowd and people kind of like, yeah, that's us. There's a sense of that's who we are at our best, and that's what I always think of is inspirational, if that makes sense at all. So that's kind of the way I think about it. Yeah. Claire, hi.
Thank you for sharing so much of your personal story. That's special. I think when you talked about the traits that we would look at for our own work and leadership and professional life, it made me think of President Obama. So I've been so fascinated by him. I've read his 2 books, and then I read a biography of his mother. And I believe, and I wonder what you think, is I felt like some of his self-regulation with all the hate and all the things that happened was due to all the reflection he did before he ran. They couldn't say he smoked marijuana then. He'd already put it in the book. You couldn't say that he dated the white girl and blah, blah, blah. So I always felt that gave him something. Now, part of that detachment, I think at times was hard in the leadership part of his work. But anyway, I wondered if you would speak to that.
Yeah, I was impressed. I think he tried to be pretty authentic and honest and all that stuff. I think there were probably flaws, too, in his approach in terms of some of the coalition building that I thought maybe he could have done earlier on. I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's part of it. I always go back to the era of Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan at night, having, a drink together or something and talking across the aisle. And even George Nethercutt, as he and I were talking, I was like, yeah, I really didn't really like you, and now it's like this very friendly. He goes, Joe, but that's what makes it work, right? We can talk, we can be, civil with each other and stuff. And I think Obama grew in that direction over time, but initially, he was a senator, and jumped, a young senator, and jumped right into this role around coalition building. And there's a lot of stuff that he had to learn on the job kind of thing. But I do think personality-wise, he really tried to be pretty real and authentic. And I think people like that, his sense of humor. I think he regulated pretty well, actually. You got that sometimes with the criticisms and all that stuff that he heard. I mean, nobody's perfect, but I think he was certainly more of a statesman-like person, and I kind of like that about him. So, yeah. I'd love to hear you talk about one of your books around the most recent one.
We're lucky to have you tonight since you're retiring.
Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons I came this evening was I liked what I read about Peg and reintroducing civility into public discourse. And you said, most important, of course, is to look at behavior. But one of the things that, regardless of the party or who's the speaker or the talking head, is the choice of language and the impact that can have on receptivity, attitude, that sense of empathy or lack of empathy. And I'm just really repulsed more and more by the prevalence of war language in communications, spoken, written, whatever. It just seems like it's all about fight and the battle and the war, and that type of language just seems to frame even more the polarization and our lack of ability to problem solve.
Yeah.
And, you know, together. And so that's one of the main reasons I'm
Mhm.
here to check this out tonight, because I just really feel like we will continue to flounder if we don't get a better grip on this.
Yeah. And that's,
Society.
can't believe I'm referencing this, but George and I, when we were talking, we talked about the level of incivility that, and not just in politics, almost every, you know, so many arenas in our life, you'll just see this sort of tension, and it's sad. I mean, it's like, you know, let's disagree and be respectful and, you know, sort of serve the country, you know, or serve the community, whatever it might be. And you're right, I have the same concerns. And that level of sort of language usage is, you know, how do we sort of get back to a place of respect? And, but, you know, what's underneath it? Is it fear? Is it anger that people have? But it's easy to touch into a common enemy. That's an easy way to sort of mobilize people and get people together. And it's also, to me, the least attractive, you know, and give us a vision. Give me something to inspire me, you know, that I can, you know, support and get behind, because I'm not seeing that, you know. Yeah, I agree with you about this group. It's pretty impressive, really. When Ginny told me about it, I said, there's a group like that, you know. It was kind of cool. So I think I'm just about out of time, so I got to let you guys go. Gosh, I hope this has been useful in some way and sort of fun a little bit. Do people actually record this? You really do, huh? Yikes. I don't. Where does the recording go? What happens to it? Oh, does it? Website. Okay, got it. So, Ginny, do you want to make any closing thing? I should.
That you don't know about Joe. He admitted to being a Bruce Springsteen fan, but what he didn't tell you is that he's a drummer, and he's hung around with Vinnie Mad Dog Lopez, who was a backup drummer for Springsteen in the late '60s and early '70s.
First two albums. Yeah. One of my favorite people. So
You should try playing with Eddie.
yes. I'm just trying to work on myself. That's all I'm gonna do. So anyway, thank you all. Yeah.